Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Planet Pulse Pacific podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Yugambeh country in Queensland. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. Finally, if you find value in this podcast, please share it with a friend to help us get the word out, or consider buying us a coffee if you'd like to help support our work. Professor Niki Harré is the Head of School for Psychology in the Faculty of Science at the University of Auckland. Niki is the author of 2 books, Psychology for a Better World, Working with People to Save the Planet, and The Infinite Game, How to Live Well Together. Niki's research addresses issues of sustainability, values, and care for the common good. The question that drives Niki's research is how to engage people in creating a more sustainable and equitable society. I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating chat today, so let's just jump straight in. Niki, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here, Emma and Ben.
Niki, you and I met earlier this year in July as we were both panelists at the Climate Action Conference hosted by the Youth Climate Collective. And you shared so many brilliant little nuggets of wisdom during the session. But of course, we're on a panel. We're very much restricted by time. So we absolutely needed to have you on the show so we could spend plenty of time to deep dive your thoughts. But first, tell us a little bit about what drew you to the world of psychology.
Well, how can you not be interested in psychology? I want to answer that in the negative. To me, people are endlessly fascinating. I am absolutely intrigued by the human condition. I've been in this game for a very long time and I still can't figure people out. So to me, it's an endless field to explore. And I love reading about people's experiences. The deeper people go, the better. I'm one of these people that doesn't do small talk very well, straight for the jugular, really interested in who you are and what you're about. So that's a brief answer to your question, Ben.
Well, let's draw it out a little bit more because, of course, what we're going to talk about are 2 key things that are interlinked. And one is community and the other is, of course, sustainability. So I'll ask that question, why that particular area of psychology?
Yeah, so I am a community psychologist, as you're pointing out there. And I guess I'm very interested in the internal experience of people, but I became aware very early on that had a huge amount to do with their relationships with others, with the cultural conditions in which they're in, with the problems they're facing. We as human beings actually face rather similar problems no matter where we are. We need to eat, we need to get on with other people, we need to put at least some attention and care into the natural environment around us and so on. And so I became really interested in how people live well together. And as Eva pointed out, it's the subtitle of my book about the infinite game. And it seems to be the hardest part of all those problems we face, really, is how to get on with other people. And yet, of course, it's also the thing that brings us great joy, a sense of purpose. As human beings, we are deeply social, so we're driven to be in relationship with each other. And yet we self-sabotage as well. One of the ironies of me as a community psychologist is, in many ways, I don't think I'm very good at doing community. A colleague's wife once said that psychologists always study the things they aren't. So her husband studied vision because he wore glasses. People who study developmental psychology in children usually don't have any. People who study romantic relationships have difficulty being in one. So it figures that as a community psychologist, I'm not actually one of those naturally gregarious people. And maybe it's because we lack the thing, whatever it is, that we're particularly fascinated by how it works.
So is that what keeps you motivated then? Because the space you work in, it's undeniably a challenging one.
Yeah, Yeah. Well, what keeps me motivated, again, it goes back to that, why I do psychology. I I don't, I'm never unmotivated. I just have such a strong sense that the piece that we need is how to get on together. And I work in a university, a complex bureaucracy. I've worked with many organisations, businesses, and so on. And every single one of them faces issues about how to make relationships work. As we've gone through rapid social change, I think we've found it difficult to figure that one out. And when I think about the future, I've got 3 children. I've got 2 granddaughters, little granddaughters, 4.5 and 2 years old. What I want for them is to be in resilient, responsive, warm, creative communities. That's what I want for them and for our future generations. So what gets me motivated, or what gets me sort of fascinated by that, is this absolute compulsion that we need to work in this space. And also seeing around me that it's the space that's often neglected, actually. I work with lots of scientists, engineers, doctors, love them all, fantastic, get on with what you're doing. But so often people say to me, well, we can invent this or come up with this new approach, but we need people to get on board with whatever we're doing. Niki, can you help with that? Well, I can at least help talk through different possible approaches to inspiring people to get involved.
You make mention of rapid social change, and earlier you talk about working in a very bureaucratic environment. The corporate world spends plenty money and resources in how to teach to be collaborative, how to
Mm.
create, working teams, a culture, and so on. But if you look at a lot of indigenous cultures in terms of how they operate, it was all about community. It was all about working together. So, how has getting on with people changed over time? We used to be so community orientated, but now, we're happy to not be with people, or we're so bad at being. How has that changed?
Are we happy to not
What's
be with them though?
Mm. It's a really interesting question. So let's go back. I'm going back to something I said at the beginning about people being in context, being in cultural context, and I probably didn't stress it then, but to bring this piece in now, we're always in an environmental context. We've got things happening around us that we need to respond to. So if you're talking about people living close to the land in small groups of people that they've grown up with and that they're really familiar with, the task is better understood. You've had generations of people to get used to how we be together in this context and, in a sense, practice that and pass it on to each other. Of course, there were still issues. There was still warfare. There was still people exploiting the environment. There was nowhere near a kind of perfect harmony within groups, but they knew the gig. Whereas if you think about today, so think about the university where I work, since I've started, well, the internet's arrived. So now so many processes are dealt with by different types of software. More recently, we've had the COVID pandemic, which has sent people online. And so now, as human beings, in a matter of like 3 years since that all started, we're meant to have somehow figured out how to relate to people when we're all in these different environments online, in a different city, in a different country. And it's really hard to figure out those processes. So I think a simple answer to that question, Ben, is that I'm not sure that sort of we've got worse at it. It's just that the technologies and the conditions that we're living in are not familiar to us. And we haven't developed the practice and the wisdom between us as communities that pass on the how do you do this stuff. Uh, yeah, we have let, I think, in-person relationship and the task of just being with each other for very long periods of time and talking things through atrophy in a sort of busy, rushed world of getting other things done.
You mentioned framing before, Niki, and if we bring this back to your first book, Psychology for a Better World, you mentioned that in most debates around climate change and planetary health and sustainability, the framing seems to focus on the problem, whereas you put the argument forward that this may not be the best way to go about things. Would you be able to expand a little bit on what you believe is the best approach to kind of get that community collective strengthened?
Yeah, so there's a few problems with a kind of problem-focused approach. Probably the most fundamental one is that sustainability is a never-ending process. So we're never going to get there. Let's sort of get our heads around that. So if we address it as something that can be solved, we've got the wrong orientation to what life is. Life is always about people working together to try and adapt to changing conditions, changing at some level. We're undergoing more rapid change now, but communities are always dealing with, this year the harvest is good, this year it isn't, and so on, different kinds of issues. So part of it is a mindset of, this is it, people. This is it. This is what we're doing now and into the future. And the other thing about a problem-focused approach is that people then look for and battle over the solution. So often in environmental circles, one of the common things people talk about is you should be working at as high a level as possible. So the real game here is law changes, international treaties, and so on that bring about these sweeping, large-scale changes. Now, I'm certainly not against that. It would be fantastic if we had that kind of infrastructure. But actually, the way people work and the way those kinds of processes get put in place is by lots of people on the ground changing what they're doing, by organisations getting on board. You have to have the political conditions for those kinds of high-level actions to take place. So while we argue over what the problem is and the particular solution, we distract from the fact that we could just be getting on with things at each in the ways that we can work. So I'm really interested in what I call a people-focused approach, and I've worked at Western Springs College, Ngāpuno Wairea in Central Auckland, in my Faculty of Science at the University of Auckland and at Starship Children's Hospital on this process, which is to identify everyone within the organisation that's really interested in sustainability in that broad sense of the natural environment and these responsive, engaged communities. And they identify things on the ground that they could help to address. So that might be something like composting in different tea rooms, which we did in the Faculty of Science. It might be teaching case studies for students, another project from the Faculty of Science. At the school, you might be encouraging students to cycle to school, all sorts of different things. So the whole idea of a people-focused approach is we're each looking in detail at who we are and where we are and doing things together. And then I sometimes have this picture in mind that if you imagine a blank piece of paper and you've got these little dots, all these people that are interested, and then gradually the little dots increase because people are attracted to it and they start to come on board. And then eventually your entire piece of paper is covered in these joined up dots of people. And then you see a systems change. Then you see a different kind of culture in which many people are starting to hold that space. One of the key ways in which people learn is through copying. In fact, I would say it is the way that people learn. Language is a great example. Children learn to speak any language as long as they're exposed to it by copying, complex copying, actually. So if you have an organisation or a community in which people are doing things and getting active, then other people are starting to copy that and you are growing this process. One of the wonderful things about people as learning by copying is we're also creative copiers. So we don't just mimic exactly what we see. So the compost, people see people composting, they don't just compost. They might think, oh, that's a good way to protect the planet. How about cycling? We could set up a group to da, 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 da. So they're copying the goal of the people. And that kind of approach, I think, is a really powerful way to look at the world rather than here's a problem that we've got to solve.
Just to carry on a little bit on this copying concept, it really adds sort of real value to a question that's commonly asked as well. If I take this piece of action, how much impact is it as an individual? It's just me, no one else is doing it. What's the point? But what you're invariably doing is we can say you're inspiring, you're demonstrating how it can be done, but that concept of copying is what you may not see is people might actually see what you do on a regular basis, and take that away and do something that you may never see, but effectively, a classic example I always use is my diet. I follow a plant-based diet, and I always take my meals to work, and people are always, what are you eating? You're plant-based. Why? Look at all those colors. This whole conversation that over time, people effectively start, as a family, one day a week, we're no longer eating meat, or, we're really trying to introduce some vegetarian dishes into our family meals and so on. So it just brings another, which I've never come across until I read your book, but the concept of copying just brings another dimension to this whole concept of inspiring others to change, which I really like.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on so many powerful ways to create this sustainability culture in which we're working together and creatively responding to ways to create a better world. The the interesting thing about copying is it has so many dimensions. So you're talking there about bringing in food, people seeing it, again, potentially copying some element of your behavior. You're talking about people adapting it to suit themselves and where they're in. And you were also talking about that delayed effect. So if often we're having much more influence than we often see, and that's something I think if you're a sustainability advocate, you really need to get your head around, is holding that integrity in the world, never quite knowing where that's going or what it's doing, but having almost like faith that it's worth doing because somewhere somebody or something may be changing. And besides which, it's the way you want to show up. And the interesting thing about copying, just to go a bit more into the psychology of that, is that not only do we copy what we see other people do, but we copy what's called behavioral traces. So, for example, with my cycling, because I cycle to work, so I have a helmet, obviously. I leave my bike outside on the cycle racks, although some staff take their bikes into their offices. I leave mine outside. And I leave my helmet strategically placed in my office, so anyone who comes in the door cannot help but see it. Now, they're not actually seeing me cycling, but they're seeing a trace of the fact that I do cycle via my helmet. And because our brains are so sort of nuanced and sensitive to copying, the idea is, and research has shown this, but that by seeing these traces of what other people do, your brain begins to think, oh, that's a possible thing to do. Maybe I could cycle, or at least that idea of cycling is lodged into your mind as a possibility. It's one of the reasons why when I'm talking with organizations, I always say cycle racks should not be in the basement for safety purposes. They should be in front of the building for modeling purposes so that people get the idea that we cycle around here. And another interesting feature of copying is that people also copy stories. So one of the powerful ways that you can, if you like, accentuate those actions that you're doing is telling stories. Now you have to be subtle the way you are, Ben. So you're sitting down eating your lunch and you say, oh, what are you eating? You don't declare to everybody that you should be eating vegan food and tell those stories. But given the opportunity, you engage in a discussion with them, and I'm sure you start to talk about other meals you've had and so on. One good way to get your head around this is, I think everybody listening will have been to a movie about something they've never even thought of doing before, climbing a mountain or whatever it is. And you walk out of that movie thinking, right, I'm going to climb a mountain. And all you've seen is a story. All you've been exposed to is something that's just potentially just made up. So when we can imagine ourselves being in that situation through a story, we're also deeply attracted to it. At the organizational level, I think showcasing and talking about what different teams are doing right is a really important way to get this idea out.
Something else you mentioned in your book is also emotions and flows. And I've seen you talk before about how some people almost have this fight or flight response to the apocalyptic narrative that we're exposed to so frequently. Could you talk to us about these negative emotional responses versus the more positive ones, and what the difference can actually be in terms of facilitating change and transformation?
Yeah, so I'm use the work of Barbara Fredrickson, a US-based psychologist, quite a bit to think about how emotions work. So she suggests that emotions have three parts to them. One is what's going on in our body. So in the case of negative emotions, and you mentioned flight or fight, so fear and anger. Fear is a withdrawal, flight response. Anger is a fight, aggressive response. And then there's other negative emotions like sort of boredom or apathy and so on. So very often with negative emotions, the body is either tense, nervous, agitated, ready to spring, or sort of sometimes lethargic. And that's things like sort of depression and apathy and so on. Now, so that's the body. The other thing that's going on is our mind is full of images. So with these negative emotions, we tend to have one-track minds that are just full of the images that we're flooded with in relation to the person that's infuriated us if we're angry, or those horrific images of climate change, potentially, for people who are in a state of eco-anxiety. And then the third aspect to emotions is they make us want to do things. So negative emotions, anger, fear, and so on, make us want to solve the problem. And so our mind is obsessively going over how we can solve the problem. Now, one of the things this does is that it narrows our attention to the particular thing in focus. And ideally, if you can solve the problem quickly and directly, it's perfect. So, there's a tsunami coming up the road, you run away. Ideal. That's what that negative emotion is designed to do. However, the trouble with these chronic ongoing situations like climate change is that focus and that desire to solve the problem also narrows the possibility of our thinking. So with positive emotions, according to Barbara Fredrickson's theory, these open the field. These allow us to be creative, take risks, and be cooperative. Our bodies are relaxed, often alert. Our minds have got images of lots of possibilities rather than being flooded with this one track about the thing that's an issue. And our action tendencies can be way more creative, risk-taking, and cooperative. So one of the things I often talk about with groups, and I think it's a really important thing for people to at least consider, is that when we're in for the long haul, which we are with sustainability, it's always going to be with us. Some of those negative emotions prompt an awareness, a kind of jump start, wow, this is reality, some of those things. But we need tons and tons of people working in positive spaces where they're being creative, where they're working with other people, and so on. And that's what those positive emotions do. The other really difficult thing about negative emotions like fear and anger is that anger is tearing down. when you're angry, you just want justice, you want revenge, you want that person to change their ways. It's very often about what the other person should do. And there's only so far you can get by harassing people and telling them that they're doing it all wrong. Most people don't respond very well to that. And similarly, fear, that total that anxiety that life is completely going to break down and so on. That with results in a retreat, again, it doesn't get us very far. And what's more, because these emotions are so aversive, and we can't solve the problem, we often just want to get rid of the emotion itself. And that's where you step into denial. Because if I can't solve climate change and I'm absolutely terrified about it, maybe climate change isn't that bad. I did hear somebody talking on the radio that the other day about how we're going to solve it with carbon capture in a couple of years or whatever. Whereas if you're in this more positive space and working with other people and engaged in a group, then you're not so vulnerable to denial because you're, to put it bluntly, having fun as you're doing what you're doing.
So do you feel that working with other people is kind of the key here? Because it's really quite hard to keep ourselves emotionally buoyant, I suppose you could say, in the face of all the negative news and all the political inaction. It's almost bombards you if you watch the news each day. So is the key finding other people to link in with, do you think?
I think it's one of the keys. I think it's and if you put a gun to my head and say what's the key, I probably would say working with other people, because for a start, people are naturally social, so we get a lot of rewards by working with other people, and by that I mean we feel good, we feel happy, we feel acknowledged. So there's a whole bundle of stuff that, to use your word, which I really like, buoyant, keeps us buoyant. So I think that's really important. Other people, you do want, if you like, the right people. Now, I'm not about sort of telling you to reject friends that are a real downer, because they probably need the most support. But at the same time, other people can have this effect of dragging you into a space that you don't want to be in. So I think it's actually also really important to be careful with what you expose yourself to. It is not obligatory to know the latest science on climate change. Sorry, scientists, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. But if you find that too difficult psychologically, that sets you into fear, makes you want to deny it, and paralyzes you in terms of action, ignore it. Because you don't actually need to know it to do the right thing. To things like the plant-based diet, riding your bike, working with others on composting, avoiding flying. All of those things, they're true now, and they're true no matter how bad or even better or whatever the climate change outlook gets. So the other great thing I think, Emma, too, about the working with other people goes back to that, how I was talking at the beginning about the real importance of those resilient and strong communities. So you're also setting the foundation for how we're going to get through all of this together.
So I'm actually going to not pause, but I'm going to use this next 10 seconds to do a little promo, because we keep referring to it. And I know we mentioned at the beginning, but Psychology for a Better World, a book that I read very recently, obviously for this conversation, published in 2011, first published. So 13 years old, still extremely relevant. And I really encourage our listeners to go out there and buy this book. A lot of amazing stories and so much that it's worth reading 3-4 times and still hopefully something sinks in. But one of the aspects I really liked in this book, there's a lot that I really liked in there actually, but one of the key areas is the importance of identity, because you talk about finding our people, basically communities, and sharing the burden, sharing the successes, sharing the actions that we're taking. But personal identity is still important. And I like how you use your own story about the tidy person story. Tell us a little bit more about why still having an identity, a personal identity, is still crucial in this whole journey.
Yeah, so perhaps I will tell the tidy person story here. It's so when our son, who's now 31, was 6 months old, so it's 30 years ago now, my husband and I went to look at a house that was for sale, and it was absolutely immaculate. There was something about that house, looking around that house, that I suddenly realized what tidiness was and meant, and projected myself into living in it because, we were interested in buying it, and lived with that image of me in this house for about a week until our offer was turned down and we didn't buy the house, something I regretted for about 10 years after that. But what did happen, a permanent effect of having seen that house, is that when I walked back to our messy house, I suddenly realized that I was going to be a tidy person. Now, it wasn't really a decision. It was like some switch had changed in me, probably due, I think, to the imaginative putting myself in that environment and seeing myself as that kind of person, a bit like the copying that we were talking about before. And so from then on, at that moment, I became a tidy person. Now, I became a tidy person with an extremely messy house. So I took on an identity and I took on a project which I've never dropped. And over the years, I've got tidier and tidier. I actually thought about writing a book about being a tidy person at one stage, but I think Marie Kondo's done that extremely well with the life-changing magic of tidying up, which I have read about 4 times, and she took me to a whole new level. And actually, tidying, if we can linger for a little bit on that as a slight side topic, also really interests me, because as you become tidier and tidier, one of the things that you do is you get less and less stuff. Because once you are really focused on the idea of everything having a place and being in its place and putting it back in its place, you don't want much stuff, because each item takes quite a lot of management. So my clothes drawers, for example, everything's folded, put in place. I can see everything at a glance by opening the drawer, and I wouldn't want more things in there than I can fit into the drawer. And I also each winter and each summer I exchange some of the clothes. In other words, I put away some summer clothes and winter clothes, and I repair things, because part of my aesthetic is that the objects themselves look tidy. So a hem that's falling down or something like that, I will tidy up. And related to that, I care for objects a great deal, and I really do look after things as well as I possibly can. So that thing is partly about, the example I use in the book is partly about the sudden transformation from one kind of person into another kind of person. But the orientation of being tidy is actually quite a good metaphor, really, for taking extreme care with resources and the incredible pleasure and aesthetics in that act itself. So I'll leave that aside for a moment and talk about your actual question in relation to identity now. So people have these schemas or identities or ways of viewing the world that are about their self-concept, who they think they are, and where they think they fit in. I'm a cyclist, so that's another one of my identities. Obviously, Ben, you've talked about in this podcast, has a plant-based diet as at a centre, so that's an important identity that you and Emma share, but it's also a way of being in the world. And many of these identities are easy to label. Those two we just talked about are things that we recognise in other people. And one of the things as human beings is that we do tend to respond really quickly and easily to people when we realise that we share an identity. I love having conversations with other tidy people. They give me lots of tips to how I can do something else in a particular way. And again, with diet, there's endless conversations you can have with people who have the same diet. And when they say something like, hey, did you know blah, 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 you trust them because you know that you're aligned on this really important dimension. So when a cyclist talks to me about cycling, I trust them at a different level to when somebody who never cycled talks to me. So one of the things when we're talking about human groups is we need to be really aware of these different identity configurations that people have. And there's lots of research that shows that persuasive communication works better between people that have got an identity point in common, and when you're talking through that identity point. Now, one of the things I think I also want to say in relation to that is that we're also all human beings. So while we do have all these different identities, and it's important to recognize that, we also have these really core human bases. So one of the things I never advocate is thinking, for example, there's a businessman, they're rich, all they care about is money. So the way I'm going to get them to is tell them that it'll make them lots of money. Now, don't do that because you're trying to play an identity game that you're not actually in. So it won't be very persuasive. And also, if that person seems really different to you, think hard about what you might have in common. So that business person might actually be interested in the natural world, might actually have children that they want to grow up in a planet that's not ruined by climate change, and so on. I've probably said enough for now on that.
And just finally, flowing on from that, one of the final points you make in the book is you touch on humans fundamentally being moral creatures. So why and how do you think we should frame sustainability issues as moral issues?
Yeah, well, I think I've moved a little bit away from the moral framing. So what I talked about in the book, and it's not that I still think this is kind of correct, if you like, but I'm not convinced so much it's as useful as other ways to talk about it. So we'll go into both. So in the book, I talk about lots of research on children, for example, showing that children can distinguish from a moral realm, things that are right and wrong, from a conventional realm in which things may be still right and wrong, but they can be changed. So, for example, something like, say, a child at school, you're not meant to eat in front of the computers at school, for example. Children know that that's a conventional rule. It's not an absolute rule that you have to follow in all circumstances all the time. Whereas they know something like don't bully other children is a moral rule, because it's not about the logistics of it or the nature of the situation. It's about bullying being an intrinsically harmful thing to another human being. So children can distinguish these two kinds of rules, and this research has also shown that things that are in this moral domain, considered a matter of right and wrong in an absolute sense to children, have two fundamental things underlying them. One is they're concerned with fairness, so children think things should be fair, and the other is that you should not harm innocent others. So one of the things in relation to that is is important is that when we are talking about persuasive communication, when we're talking about the right kinds of ways to move people forward, we need to understand that people will be considering fairness, and they will be considering the degree to which other people are, if you like, innocent. So one of the examples that I talk about in the book too with children is how animals are very often something that children and adults, of course, are very keen to protect because they are seen as innocent in relation to not having caused any of the conditions that they are now suffering under. But the reason, I'm going to just segue immediately into the reason why I've myself personally moved away quite a bit from talking about right and wrong and moral language, even though I think it's still part of the human repertoire, is because I think in many ways a more useful way forward for us as communities is to think about the way in which we want to live. So that sounds sort of selfish in a way. So if the three of us sat around and discussed how we want to live, you might think we'd come up with all these plans for getting the best we can out of life. But actually, I bet if I was to ask you, I bet you want to live in a world in which, well, I know this because I've listened to your podcast, so I'm cheating, but you want to live in a world in which animals are flourishing, in which ecosystems are doing well, in which nature is valued for its own sake, in which people are treated with care, in which children don't go hungry, in which, yes, you know you can rely on a health system that will look after you if you're ill, but that everyone else can too. So in other words, the, and this is me projecting because those are all the things I want in the world as well. If you actually trust people to talk about the kind of world they want to live in, I think you find that it's a really generous world of flourishing and care for each other and for the planet. And the great thing about moving it from what's right and wrong into what kind of world do you want to live in is there's kind of no argument with that. Like, people can't really say to me, no, Nikki, you don't want to live in a world in which everyone has access to good health care. And it's like, well, I'm sorry, I do. Like, end of argument. We can have another kind of argument if we like, but you can't tell me what kind of world I want to live in. You could start probing me and saying, well, why do you want that? Or what do you want about that? And then we could work to this really deep level to understand collectively the kind of world that we all want to live in. And why I think that's more powerful in many ways than right and wrong, apart from that you sort of can't argue with it. You really have to respect it, and you really have to listen to it, and you really have to understand it, all qualities that I think are essential for living well together, is that it takes away self-righteousness, because I'm not talking about morality or you being right or wrong. I'm just talking about the kind of world I want to live in. And I think it stops a lot of these us them games that environmentalists so often get into, where they're bad, they're doing the wrong thing, and I'm doing the right thing. And anyone who knows the tiniest bit about human history knows that, wars are fought in the name of what's right. So it's kind of a dangerous position to be in some ways.
Sounds like there might be a new edition of the book coming out soon then.
Well, Ben,
Changing.
actually, that copy you're holding out was revised in 2018. So it is only, whatever, you can do the math, 6 years out of date. But of course, as you also very generously said, for better or worse, these issues don't go away.
No,
In our
look, still,
psychology.
still very much relevant, absolutely. But
Mm,
I think
mm,
you raise a very valid point in terms of, because morality, how do we base our morals? We're still taught to some degree, aren't we? So that can be
yeah.
biased, based on so many facets of how that bias is formed. So if you genuinely ask someone, how they view it, and like you say, you can then take that to a debate, a discussion, and sort of reach a more common sort of outcome.
Mm,
But
mm.
you mentioned you've worked with schools, you've worked with youth, you've mentioned you enjoy working with the youth. Why are the youth so important?
Well, part of it actually, to go to the answer I just gave, is I like working with them in a way. like it's the kind of world I want to live in. I just really enjoy that fresh energy, the enthusiasm. I feel really just tender, I suppose, towards young people, and I don't mind reinventing the wheel. It's funny, when I was working in a school, because I worked with Western Springs College Napuna Wairea for about 12 years on this our sustainability, ongoing sustainability project we were doing there is, almost every year we get a new batch of student leaders, and almost every year they'd suggest the same kind of projects, and almost every year they'd go okay, but there'd be, massive failures along the way as well. And the people I work with, the teachers, I love them to bits because they're just, that's a great idea. Let's see how we can make that work, rather than, oh, we tried that and it failed. So I just feel really open to people who are, I'm really open to people who are learning, and I love to learn myself. I've that's one of the most enjoyable parts of my life, is learning new things. So being around young people who care, and their caring is so moving. And it's not just caring for themselves, it's not just caring out of fear, but you see young people who've just got such strong visions for the way the world could be, and so much energy and possibility for moving forward on that. So in many ways, the question of why I think youth are important is in a way secondary to why I find so much energy and inspiration in working alongside them. Obvious, I think actually all people are just as important. So I don't think young people are any more important in the sustainability than older people. In fact, it's older people that have often got power, got wealth, got resources. It would be nice if they got their act together as well. I think everyone's important.
Mm. Do you worry about them, about the youth?
It's an interesting question. I worry about them. So as I said, I've got two granddaughters. Bizarrely, I don't worry about them. I get irritated and frustrated that no, I get irritated and frustrated by people taking more than their share out of the commons. That's probably the thing that just I find really difficult to cope with personally, because I think life would be so much better if we held back and allowed both the natural systems to flourish and other people to get their share. So I get really frustrated at that, and I sort of wish that young people weren't moving into a world in which so much is kind of taken. Like it's super hard to own a home because all the homes are taken, and if you're lucky, your parents own 3 homes, so you get one at the end of the day or whatever. And most children don't get any, so that really frustrates me. But no, I wouldn't say I'm worried, because again, I have such a sort of long-term view in a way. I was born in 1961, so I grew up as a in the expectation there'd be a nuclear war. Now, when I started to sort of twig to international, goings on at the age of 12, whatever, I entered into a state of dread about this impending nuclear war. There were awful films and books floating around about the nuclear winter and so on. And even in my late teens, I was actually pretty unhappy for quite a long period in my late teens and early 20s. I expected not to live beyond 30. I thought having children was out of the question. I was glad to be in the southern hemisphere, because at least the northern hemisphere would go first and I might have a few months longer. I mean, honestly, it was grim. And so so far, touch wood, it hasn't happened. So I actually think that a type of language I'm not very keen on is people talking about us being in a unique phase of existential crises. This is often said as if human populations have not faced this before. Well, I faced it in the 1970s for sure. And you imagine being people who live on a riverbank where the river floods regularly. That would feel pretty damn scary. You imagine being, a small iwi where your neighbours are potentially planning to invade you. That would feel pretty damn scary. In other words, I actually think human beings always live with, at some level, this massive threatening possibility that they might individually and collectively be obliterated. I think it is part of what it means to be a human being. And as I said at the very beginning, therefore I think our task is to live well with each other now, to keep responding creatively and compassionately to what is going on now. So even for that, my little 2-year-old Molly and 4.5-year-old Isla, my little granddaughters, I just hope they're surrounded by people that have that kind of generous, creative response. And I guess to put that question slightly differently, or to think about it slightly differently, when you asked it, the implication was, am I more worried than I would be if I was in a different time? No, because they're just human beings having to face human stuff. And I hope they do it well.
So this might be a little bit of a detour, but it could flow on in terms of coping with that kind of stress. In 2021, you took a research and study leave to explore what religious insights could offer the secular world. You dubbed that project Secular Priest, and that sounds really, really fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey and kind of what inspired it and what you learned from it?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. It was extremely. It was really quite transformational for me. So the Infinite Game book, which I wrote in between, I'll just talk about that very briefly because it's really relevant here. It's one of the things doing. I did the Psychology for a Better World book, and that really did bring me a lot of bring. I was invited into a lot of communities and spaces as a result of that book, and sort of learned so much about what was going on. It was, a huge privilege to be in those spaces. And one of the things I really realized was that there was this tension between the natural environment and people. And I was really keen to find a way of talking about those both together and trying to avoid putting them against one another and bringing them together. So I came across this metaphor of the infinite game by the philosopher and theologian James Cass, who said that the infinite game is about keeping the game in play. I thought, what a beautiful way to talk about sustainability. So I really developed that metaphor in my work and expanded it to the idea that the infinite game is about keeping what we most deeply value in play and inviting others into the game. And did a lot of work on that in terms of asking people what they most deeply value and so on. And as part of that work, as I was getting into that, I started to just very slowly read a little bit of theology and religious writing, and realized, even though I was brought up in a Christian culture, I'm a Kiwi, but I was brought up atheist, so it was all really new to me. I really did not realize what religion was about. I was quite religiously illiterate. And I thought, wow, they're talking about the things that I really believe in: humility, complexity, uncertainty, awe, um, giving yourself to something that's bigger than you, the diminishing of your own importance for the sake of this sort of grand idea. So that infinite game, project got me sort of slightly into looking into religion. And then in this bizarre way, like I became a tidy person, I guess, I kind of decided that I was a priest. Quite weird, and I don't know how I did this. Um, if I try to tell a story about why I decided I was a priest, and an atheist priest or secular priest, was because I always feel like what I'm doing, I have this Trojan horse in a way, my title of professor and academic studies and so on. But what I'm really, really trying to say to people is, listen to each other, talk to each other, accept that you're in a complex, unknown mystery, and that's beautiful and wonderful. That's so, and that's what priests say, actually. So I was really keen to explore a role that didn't have as well. Of course, priests have tons of rigid rules. I was so naive, but I had this idea that I could be in this sort of more open uh, space in which I'm speaking from the heart, I guess, speaking from the heart. And I had this ridiculous idea that I could do sermons. I became obsessed with this idea that I could write and deliver sermons, and that they'd be way more fun than lectures. So I had a 1 year sabbatical coming up, and I decided that I would explore Christianity, because it is the religion of my culture. Again, brought up atheist, but it's the religion I'm closest to, and I wanted to explore a religion that would have as little cultural gap for me as possible. So, if I looked into Islam, there would potentially be a bigger cultural difference between me and practitioners. So I wanted them to be people as like me as I could get, so I could kind of extract the religious element. And then I thought, well, I'll set myself up as a priest, and I'll deliver services, get to do my sermons, and people will come along to my services, and then we'll all co-discover together what the secular world has lost, that we could bring it back into our practice. So I spent this year attending a Christian church, Rhythms of Grace. Shout out for them. Learnt so much about what a well-functioning Christian community can deliver in terms of community, humility, so many of those things we value, care for the planet as well. And in my own services, I had a little bit of difficulty persuading people to come along, because I realized, again, so naive, that for so many people, religion is this huge trigger. For me as atheist, I'm just fascinated by it, but a lot of people have deliberately left behind Christianity and got stories to tell. And so quite a lot of people are sort of actively, well, not exactly against my project, but disinterested, people I thought would be interested. So I ran services for a whole year on Sundays, most Sundays, and gradually people did start to come around. I got to give my sermons, and a couple of other people gave sermons too, and I attended this Christian church, and I had these things called personal conversations, whereby people were invited to just come along and actually discuss anything they wanted with me. So it was sort of priest-like, but also a little bit psychologist-like, and I actually had 48 of those personal conversations, which was just all people coming to me. I didn't try and recruit people, apart from setting up a website and saying, hey, this is available, along with my services as well. So I learned so much about how to be in the world, and some of those practices, because not only am I not religious, I wasn't spiritual either. I'd never done meditation or anything like that, but I learned to meditate, and did really come to value that. I think one of the fascinating things about meditation and those ways of removing yourself from the world is that they give you that distance and that calming, and that realization that there's a force of some kind, a kind of life force and energy, something that you can realize is bigger than the particulars of your life. So I'm still, to some extent, processing all of that work, but I do think in the secular world that we're in, we've often lost the language and motivation for the common good, and become quite fearful and inward and self-protective. And I'm very keen to think about ways that we can move in a different direction.
Now, to our listeners, secularpriest.org, we will put a link in our show notes. There's wonderful, more in-depth debrief images, even a TEDx talk on that website. So we'll certainly share that with our listeners. Now, a lot of our listeners are advocates in their own right, and I'm certain that all of them would be really enjoying this conversation. But for them in particular, any key recommendations in terms of either as individuals, which is what a lot of this conversation is focused on, and communities, the communities that they're involved in, how to facilitate resilience? Because there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of people that just are unaware, are just not, there's a lot going on that is so easy to discourage and sort of, makes it a bit more challenging to stay positive and so on. So some parting sort of recommendations for our listeners to keep on doing the amazing work that they do. How do we facilitate that resilience?
Yeah, well, one important thing, and probably segueing from just thinking about religion for a moment, you can't be a prophet in your own land is something that you might have heard before. And very often people that I'm talking with say, it's my father, it's my brother, it's my sister, it's my partner. They will not put things in the correct recycling bin or whatever it is. They insist on driving their car to the dairy or whatever it is. And so one thing I think, just so we all understand out there, it's often your family that are the hardest people to change. Don't worry about it. Let them be who they are, because the most important thing is that you stay connected to them and don't feel that it's your job to somehow convert them. That is not your job. Stay in relationship with them. And as you were saying, Ben, before about the plant-based diet, now people sort of start thinking, oh, maybe I could do that a day a week. Just see, you've got many years with these people. So just sort of see how over the years, if something changes, and if it doesn't, so be it. Now, moving from that idea of when those people closest to you are not getting with the program and how frustrating that is, and how you have my permission to give up on them in that sense, I invite you to apply the same rule to the other people in your circle. Don't worry about the ones that are resistant. Pay attention to the ones that want to do something. You remember I was talking about the piece of paper and the dots that all get joined up? Your job, my advice to you is that your job is to nurture and work with and support the other people that are interested and showing an interest. The minute somebody shows interest, my goodness, you get in there subtly, of course. You don't want them to feel like they've gotten your clutches and they can't escape. Although sometimes I say that to people, I say, sorry, you're in my clutches now. I'm not going to let you go, because those are the people. It's inspiring and helping those people get strong that we are going to create this movement. So that's my first and central piece of advice. Work with those who are there, who have something to teach you, or who are willing to learn from you, and join together and do that little bit more each year. Now, I kind of first properly heard about climate change about 2005, when I seem to be talking about all these sudden moments in my life during this podcast. I'm not sure why, but it was like I kind of suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this thing's happening, and it's my business. It's all about business. I need to get with this program. And way back in 2005, goodness, that's nearly 20 years ago now, isn't it? People were saying it's urgent. It's urgent. And it's like this whole urgent thing. And I'm thinking, if people had just said in 2005, what can I do tomorrow? What can I do to the next day? We might have had communities that were further along the line with all this. And if everybody had been saying, it's urgent, we've got to get the government to put in legislation, we've got to blah, 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 and putting all this pressure on others instead of getting on with the job of making life work for us. So you work with those closest to you. You do the next thing that is in front of you. Now, that might be standing for Parliament and lobbying for change and whatever, but it might be just having your one plant-based meal a week. It might be just riding your bike or taking the bus once a week or so on. All of that matters. All of that matters. And, in the end, do you want to be in this game? Like, to me, it's the most enticing game there is. Do you want to be in this game? Or do you want to be, consuming lots of stuff and, flying to Sydney for the weekend to do even more consumption, like, what really appeals to you, and what space are you in, and what is it that gives you great joy. For most people, when they actually think about that question, what is it gives you most joy, it is that being able to express themselves, being in community with others. None of us really want to take more than our share. We just get caught in these competitive games. So work in those spaces with each other, kind of look after each other. And I'm not really talking about being kind so much as, because sometimes I think you can challenge people a little bit potentially, but sort of being aware of those kindred spirits, and keeping true to them. And going back to what I said at the beginning, you do not have to keep up with the news. You do not. And please, please do this one thing. Slightly rambling here because I'm going back to the youth now. This is one thing. If you're listening to this and you're over the age of 18 years, please control your fear when you are around young people, because feeling fear, that's fine. People feel what they feel. I'm not going to tell you not to feel anything, but I am going to tell you to be incredibly careful when you are talking to young people, not to pass that on to them. And almost sometimes in environmental spaces, it seems to have become part of your eco cred to pass on fear. It's weird. It's like, unless I show I'm terrified by this and I'm in grief and I'm terribly anxious, I'm not a real environmentalist, that identity issue. Well, I give you permission to not be angry and not be fearful. And again, I instruct you, beg you, not to do that around young people. To segue into that for a minute, I do not mean to cover up the truth. I do not mean that for a minute. I mean that if you've got yourself in a place where for you personally, you can handle the truth, so you can imagine huge weather events, losing your home, losing your money. I mean, let's get real, losing family members. If you can imagine that and thinking, and still being able to say, this is the world I want to live in, I can still live with hope and optimism. You need to be in that space when you're talking about these things, and keeping them in perspective and saying them factually. Because passing on that fear message, I don't think it's doing the world any good. So you asked me about how we keep ourselves resilient, and I want to say we keep ourselves resilient, but we're also constantly aware of our responsibility to keep other people resilient. And so that those two are your tasks, or my advice, depending on how we put it.
Professor Niki Harré, thank you. So much in-depth, valuable, insightful advice. There's so many takeaways. Emma's going to have a great job writing some show notes on this. But I mean, there's so much that stood out, and I've been scribbling some little notes because I'd like to retain things. But one of the key things as individuals, because this was really the theme of this conversation, was the whole point you made about holding integrity and having faith in your own journey, because ultimately others will follow. And how it's that whole concept of copying, and people will copy in their own way. We won't see it, and that's where the faith also comes in. Because we need instant gratification, we need instant results, we need to see it. If we don't see it, well, then there's no point in doing it, is there? So I may as well move on to the next thing. But no, we don't see a lot of it. So having faith and conviction in what we're doing and continuing to do it, ultimately there will be others. And as we always say, it's the collective that amounts to impactful change, not the individual. But we're actually impacting and inspiring more than we realize. So hopefully our listeners have taken all of this away. We'll digest, we'll re-listen to this episode and take more in. We'll find the time to read the book, because there's a lot more to learn. But Niki, thank you so much. This has been a long-awaited conversation because we had a break with our podcast, but we're so really delighted to finally have had you on the show. And thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate the work that you do in the communities and sharing this with our listeners on this podcast. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Emma. It's been a really enjoyable and deep conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.